Castles have played an important military, economic and social role in Great Britain and Ireland since their introduction following the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Although a small number of castles had been built in England, in the 1050s the Normans began to build motte and baronial ringworks castles in large numbers to control the newly occupied territories in England and the Welsh Marches. During the 12th century the Normans began to build more castles in stone, with characteristic square keeps that played both military and political roles. Royal castles were used to control key towns and the economically important forests, while baronial castles were used by the Norman lords to control the widespread estates. David I invited Anglo-Norman lords into Scotland in the early 12th century to help him colonize and control areas of his kingdom such as Galloway. The new lords brought castle technologies with them and wooden castles began to be established over the south of the kingdom. Following the Norman invasion of Ireland in the 1170s under Henry II, castles were established. The two castles continued to grow in military sophistication and comfort during the 12th century, leading to a sharp increase in the complexity and length of sieges in England, while in Ireland and Wales castle architecture continued to follow that of England. After the death of Alexander III, the trend in Scotland moved away from the construction of larger castles towards the use of smaller tower houses. The tower house style would also be adopted in the north of England and Ireland in later years. In North Wales, Edward I built a sequence of militarily powerful castles after the destruction of the last Welsh polities in the 1270s. By the 14th century, castles were combining defences with luxurious, sophisticated living arrangements and heavily landscaped gardens and parks. Many royal and baronial castles were left to decline, so that by the 15th century only a few were maintained for defensive purposes. A small number of castles in England and Scotland were developed into Renaissance-era palaces that hosted lavish feasts and celebrations amid their elaborate architecture. Such structures were, however, beyond the means of all but royalty and the richest of the late medieval barons. Although gunpowder weapons were used to defend castles from the late 14th century onwards, it became clear during the 16th century that, provided artillery could be transported and brought to bear on a besieged castle, gunpowder weapons could also play an important attack role. The defences of coastal castles around the British Isles were improved to deal with this threat, but investment in their upkeep once again declined at the end of the 16th century. Nevertheless, in the widespread civil and religious conflicts across the British Isles during the 1640s and 1650s, castles played a key role in England. Modern defences were quickly built alongside existing medieval fortifications and, in many cases, castles successfully withstood more than one siege. In Ireland, the introduction of heavy siege artillery by Oliver Cromwell in 1649 brought a rapid end to the utility of castles in the war, while in Scotland the popular tower houses proved unsuitable for defending against Civil War artillery, although major castles such as Edinburgh put up strong resistance. At the end of the war, many castles were slighted to prevent future use. Military use of castles rapidly decreased over subsequent years, although some were adapted for use by garrisons in Scotland and key border locations for many years to come, including during the Second World War. Other castles were used as county jails, until parliamentary legislation in the 19th closed most of them down. For a period in the early 18th century, castles were shunned in favour of Palladian architecture, until they re-emerged as an important cultural and social feature of England, Wales and Scotland, and were frequently improved during the 18th and 19th centuries. Such renovations raised concerns over the protection so that today castles across the British Isles are safeguarded by legislation. Primarily used as tourist attractions, castles form a key part of the national heritage industry. Historians and archaeologists continue to develop our understanding of British castles, while vigorous academic debates in recent years have questioned the interpretation of physical and documentary material surrounding their original construction and use. Norman invasion, Anglo-Saxon fortifications. The English word castle derives from the Latin word castellum and is used to refer to the private fortified residence of a lord or noble. The presence of castles in Britain and Ireland dates primarily from the Norman invasion of 1066. Before the arrival of the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons had built burhs, fortified structures with their origins in 9th-century Wessex. Most of these, especially in urban areas, were large enough to be best described as fortified townships rather than private dwellings, and therefore not usually classed as castles. Rural burhs were smaller and usually consisted of a wooden hall with a wall enclosing various domestic buildings along with an entrance, called a burgate, which was apparently used for ceremonial purposes. Although rural burhs were relatively secure, the role was primarily ceremonial and they too are not normally classed as castles. There were, however, a small number of castles which were built in England during the 1050s, probably by Norman knights in the service of Edward the Confessor. These include Hereford, Clavering, Richard's Castle and possibly Ewes Harold Castle and Dover. Invasion. William, Duke of Normandy, invaded England in 1066 and one of his first actions after landing was to build Hastings Castle to protect his supply routes. Following the victory at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans began 3 phases of castle building. The first of these was the establishment, by the new king, of a number of royal castles in key strategic locations. This royal castle program focused on controlling the towns and cities of England and the associated lines of communication, including Cambridge, Huntingdon, Lincoln, Norwich, Nottingham, Warwick and York. Of the castles built by William the Conqueror, 2/3 were built in towns and cities, often those with the former Anglo-Saxon mints. These urban castles could make use of the existing town's walls and fortifications, but typically required the demolition of local houses to make space for them. This could cause extensive damage, and records suggest that in Lincoln 166 houses were destroyed, with 113 in Norwich and 27 in Cambridge. Some of these castles were deliberately built on top of important local buildings, such as the burhs or halls of local nobles, and might be constructed so as to imitate aspects of the previous buildings, such as the gatehouse at Rougemont Castle in Exeter, which closely resembled the previous Anglo-Saxon burh tower. This was probably done to demonstrate to the local population that they now answered to the new Norman rulers. The second and third waves of castle building were led by the major magnates, and then by the more junior knights on the new estates. The apportionment of the conquered lands by the king influenced where these castles were built. In a few key locations the king gave his followers compact groups of estates, including the 6 rapes of Sussex and the 3 earldoms of Chester, Shrewsbury and Hereford, intended to protect the line of communication with Normandy and the Welsh border respectively. In these areas the barons' castles were clustered relatively tightly together, but in most of England the nobles' estates, and therefore their castles, were more widely dispersed. As the Normans pushed on into South Wales, they advanced up the valleys, building castles as they went and often using the larger castles castles of the neighbouring earldoms as a base. As a result, castle building by the Norman nobility across England and the Marches lacked a grand strategic plan, reflecting local circumstances such as military factors and the layout of existing estates and church lands. Castles were often situated along the old Roman roads that still formed the backbone for travel across the country, both to control the lines of communication and to ensure easy movement between different estates. Many castles were built close to inland river ports, and those built on the coast were usually located at the mouths of rivers or in ports, Pevensey and Portchester being rare exceptions. Some groups of castles were located so as to be mutually reinforcing, for example the castles of Littledean Camp, Glasshouse Woods and Howell Hill Camp were intended to act as an integrated defence for the area around Gloucester and Gloucester Castle for Gloucester City itself, while Windsor was one of a ring of castles built around London, each approximately a day's march apart. Some regional patterns in castle building can also be seen. Relatively few castles were built in East Anglia compared to the west of England or the Marches. This was probably due to the relatively settled and prosperous nature of the east of England and reflected a shortage of available serfs, or unfree labour. Not all of the castles were occupied simultaneously. Some were built during the invasions and then abandoned, while other new castles were constructed elsewhere, especially along the western borders. Recent estimates suggest that between 500 and 600 castles were occupied at any one time in the post-conquest period. Architecture. There was a large degree of variation in the size and exact shape of the castles built in England and Wales after the invasion. One popular form of castle was the motte and bailey, in which earth would be piled up into a mound to support a wooden tower, and a wider enclosed area built alongside it. Stafford Castle is a typical example of a post-invasion motte castle. Another widespread design was the ringwork, in which earth would be built up in a circular or oval shape and topped with a wooden rampart. Folkestone Castle is a good example of a Norman ringwork, in this case built on top of a hill, although most post-invasion castles were usually sited on lower ground. Around 80% of Norman castles in this period followed the motte and bailey pattern, but ringworks were particularly popular in certain areas, such as southwest England and South Wales. One theory put forward to explain this variation is that ringworks were easier to build in these shallow soil areas than the larger mottes. The White Tower in London and the Keep of Colchester Castle were the only stone castles to be built in England immediately after the conquest, both with the characteristic square Norman keep. Both these castles were built in the Romanesque style and were intended to impress as well as provide military protection. In Wales, the first wave of the Norman castles were again made of wood, in a mixture of motte and bailey and ringwork designs, with the exception of the stone-built Chepstow Castle. Chepstow too was heavily influenced by Romanesque design, reusing numerous materials from the nearby Ventosilurum to produce what historian Robert Lydiard has termed a play upon images from antiquity. The size of these castles varied depending on the geography of the site, the decisions of the builder, and the available resources. Analysis of the size of mottes has shown some distinctive regional variation. East Anglia, for example, saw much larger mottes being built than the Midlands or London, while motte and bailey and ringwork castles took great effort to build. They required relatively few skilled craftsmen, allowing them to be raised using forced labor from the local estates. This, in addition to the speed with which they could be built, a single season, made them particularly attractive immediately after the conquest. The larger earthworks, particularly mottes, required an exponentially greater quantity of manpower than the smaller equivalents and consequently tended to be either royal, or belonged to the most powerful barons who could muster the required construction effort. Despite motte and bailey and ringworks being common designs amongst Norman castles, each fortification was slightly different. Some castles were designed with 2 baileys attached to a single motte, and some ringworks were built with additional towers added on. Yet other castles were built as ringworks and later converted to motte and bailey structures.